But firstly, let me welcome all of you, particularly our panelists, to today's seminar, or webinar rather. So good evening to everyone. We are thankful to both Ambassador Vasil Bodnar, who's a very close colleague and a friend, Ambassador of Ukraine to Turkey, with whom we have had several encounters on different occasions with regard to Ukraine. And he's a very well-known person in Turkey, using social media frequently. So thank you, Ambassador, for your participation. Yevgenia Gaber, I know her very well, of course, from on different occasions. We participated together in a number of programs focusing on different issues, including, but not limited to, Turkey, or I should say Turkey-Ukraine relations. She spent several years in Turkey as the second secretary of the Ukrainian embassy in the near past. She's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, if I'm not mistaken. And for the time being, she's teaching a course at Carleton University, Ottawa. Thank you, Yevgenia Hanım. And she speaks fluent Turkish, better Turkish than many Turks, indeed. Ukraine is our strategic partner and a very close neighbor. Our Ukrainian friends are having an extremely difficult period due to the second Russian aggression after 2014, which started on the 24th of February of this year. The Russian aggressive and revisionist behavior is utterly unacceptable and constitutes a clear affront to the rules-based international order, taking its strength from international law. This aggression has been continuing more than 6 months now, and it's hard to predict when and how it will stop and what would follow after the end of its Russian hostilities in Ukraine. So without further ado, I should like to give the floor to Ambassador Bodnar to focus on the current situation prevailing in Ukraine, how this situation would evolve, and what are Ukraine's needs in these difficult times, and its forecast for the future. So, Ambassador, the floor is yours. Thank you once again.
Good evening, everyone. Your Excellencies, Zhenya Vitayu. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Thanks again for invitation, and very pleased to see all of you here today. So now we are in the very crucial moment of our history. So fighting back Russian aggression, which was purely unexpected from both military and political point of view, is now becoming the top headlines in all international media. And you have been witnessing maybe and knowing maybe more details than me, because I couldn't follow all the details of our counteroffensive. But all in all, more than 2,000 square kilometers have been liberated. Almost the whole Kharkiv region and some part of Luhansk region is being now being taken under effective control of Ukrainian armed forces. And this is the clear answer to all the discussions, how we should proceed in this war. So Russians understand only force. And that's the answer which show our military forces and forces of defense, as we show it, that strong, even maybe less, with the less number of military equipment, but motivated and maneuverable Ukrainian armed forces could do much more than very heavy armed and demotivated Russian army. So, and it leads to the first need. If I may combine, what do we need in this war? Answer is simple: weapons. Weapons which gives us a potential to beat the enemy, to push them back of our land, and maybe then we will be thinking about something which lead to the diplomacy. I'm saying something, it's not about negotiation still, because Russians understood that they are losing ground in front of our military activities, that they are losing political grounds, that their economy start to decrease, and they start to push for negotiations. So our answer is very simple. Our country is ready to start these negotiations, but they should leave our territory. So we had previously very good ground elaborated in Istanbul in the late March, and we have found some grounds for the possible compromise. But that grounds does not include the continuation of attacks from the Russian side, doesn't include massacres, it doesn't include the destruction of civilian infrastructure and many other things and criminal acts which Russia have been doing since not only beginning of war, but since April when we have these negotiations in Istanbul. So now political dimension of the story could work only on political support of Ukraine from our partners and allies. So we are counting on this support because we badly need, and the second need, not only weapons, but also financial and political assistance. Because that is the story that we are in the deficit of our budget. Most of our budget, or maybe 50+% is spent for the defense needs, and country is still running on. So even more, the countries now start to rebuild their business activities, people start to turn back from abroad, and in the liberated areas, we need to reconstruct very fast social infrastructure. So a lot of expenditures which are needed, and we ask our partners to supply us not only with weapons, but also with some financial resources. It's the second dimension of needs related to the existing situation in the ground. And also with the needs, we have seen a lot of stories around the behavior of Russia. So first of all, it's the terrorist acts, like it happened yesterday when they hit the civilian infrastructure and practically shut down 1/3 of the country because of hitting the electricity supply lines and creating, as they believe, creating chaos. But they are also using Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, using it specifically, using it to make a chantage on world community, to create a dangerous situation, and most probably try to use it as the shield against advancement of Ukrainian armed forces. So we still believe that the recommendations which the relevant commission have made from international structures, they could be implemented and we could see some kind of demilitarization. But I don't believe that Russians will go on that. So they understand that they lost already the territory, and that most probably they will lose Kherson region, as it is seen from the public media. So, but they are trying to keep this control and use it once again for their own political reasons, not for the physical, because they declared the necessity to switch off the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant from Ukrainian electricity system and switch to Russian. It is not possible now, but they still continue to do this. And in this regard, we believe that the peaceful answer for this behavior should be sanctions. Sanctions, which are now also is the issue also in some Turkish media related to some Turkish persons, but maybe we will discuss it a little bit later. But sanctions against the Russian nuclear industry, sanctions against those guys in the government who adopted such decisions, and sanctions against the persons who are implementing these decisions in the field. Also, if we go to the situation in Ukraine, so victories in the battlefield and some recoveries inside the country also give hope to people. So if we could look at the figures which we have seen now. So 92% of Ukrainians believe in victory. Very strong and very high level of support for armed forces. And also there is the other pressure from the society that without complete liberation of Ukrainian territory, as we said, within internationally recognized borders or within the borders of 1991, no one will agree to any compromise with Russia. So according to the recent data, 89% of Ukrainian citizens believe that war must end with such a result. So it is also the internal feelings, and it also breaks up the narratives of Kremlin, which leads to presenting Ukraine as a stable country which doesn't support their government, etc., and trying to use different methods of propaganda, which actually doesn't work in Ukraine, but might work to some extent in some European countries. And also the very important dimension of the story is about the energy. So as you have been witnessing, that Russia have started to intensify its energy blackmailing. And the gas prices, they stop to supply all necessary amounts of gas, etc., etc. So they create a pressure on the European countries before the heating season. And that is one of the clear evidences that they would like to use this tool against Europe to create an opportunities to press on us. It's not pressure on Europe because Europe is not involved directly in the military activities, but they are involved in support of Ukraine. And that is one of the key issues which are now in the discussions with the European Union and with our other partners to pass through this winter, to pass without losses, and to survive without majority of Russian gas. So if to say about forecasts, maybe the other questions or issues will be discussed after the Q&A session, not to bother you with all the details. The clear answer for us as the end of war is that Russia should leave all occupied territories, including Crimea and occupied territory of Donbass. There is no way to think about any other Minsk type agreements or Minsk type negotiations. We could only talk about the terms of how we would settle post-war situation, and there is no even a single word about the concession of our territories. It was clearly announced by our president, by our government, and we will be stuck to this issue. And also we press and continue to talk, publicly and continue to talk to our partners on the future of security system in Europe or global system of security. Actually, we see the clear answer from the very beginning of war that none of the international organizations worked properly well, either to stop or to prevent the war. It means that this system, which was created after World War II, failed and need to be completely reconstructed or maybe constructed a new one. Second dimension is directly about us, what we need to have in future, because the threat from the East will not disappear. And we do not believe that any miracle will happen either with Putin or with Russia. So threat will be ongoing, and we should have a response to that. So as majority of our people believe, it's maybe more than 72% of our population, that the best guarantee is NATO membership. NATO is now being more reluctant than the EU, and we should recognize it as well, because EU was adequate enough to respond correctly to the threats which possess the European security and answer it with guaranteeing us the status of candidate for the EU membership. And despite of the war, we're also working on quick changes and try to present our achievement as quick as possible. But for the security guarantees, for sure we will need a NATO. Maybe it could be some kind of transition period during which we would have some kind of international guarantees. And you know that the relevant working group was established, and Ambassador Bozkir from the Turkish side is already in this group. Hopefully it will work on some kind of guarantees which would lead to some solutions, but the strategic solution is a NATO membership, and we are not giving up this idea. So first of all, we have it in our constitution. Secondly, our population and our people need it. And also it is the only adequate response to the continuing Russian threat, because Russian threat does not disappear. And also we need to bring to responsibility those who committed criminal acts, including Russian leadership. And we are also pushing for the international, for the creation of international mechanism, which will bring these people to responsibility and will punish all the evil which was done by the Russian occupants on occupied territories and during the whole military activities against Ukraine. From your permission, maybe I will stop here and give the floor to other speakers. If any questions or suggestions would be from your side, I'll be very happy to answer or address. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We appreciate your comprehensive presentation. Now the floor is Yevgenia's. Yevgenia, please.
Thank you so much for having me here. Good evening, Your Excellencies. Вітаю, пане посол. Well, I will probably just go on picking up on where Ambassador stopped and also answering your question on what will be the end of this war and where the war will stop. And what I can tell from my expert point of view, of course, I'm not representing government now, is that there is only one way to stop this war, and this is to stop Russia, because Russia will only stop where it is stopped. And we have seen that from the very beginning. We have talked a lot about this, and we have tried to explain to many of our allies and partners that there is no way to have peace talks, peace treaties, and peace agreements with Russia, just because there is one basic principle of international law, that any kind of international treaty and agreement has to be kept. Otherwise, there is no sense in having those treaties and agreements. And unfortunately, what we see with Russia, that it has never, ever abided by the norms of international law and by the clauses of the treaties, be them bilateral, international, and that is how, unfortunately, Russia operates. I think that Ukraine has done a lot to have peaceful solution for the deoccupation of our territories, even before this new round of invasion on February 24th. And for that purpose, we had all those Minsk agreements, all those meetings within Normandy format. But if we look back at Ukrainian history, it's not about even 8 years of war with Russia. It's about centuries and centuries fighting for the independence of Ukraine. So that is why I'm always saying that this is not just a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is not Ukrainian crisis. This is not even Russian-Ukrainian conflict. This is Ukrainian war for independence, liberation war, the same that Turkey used to have almost a century ago. Because for Russia, the main reason, apart from all the geopolitical considerations and all the issues it has with NATO or other Western countries, it's about not having Ukraine as a separate independent country and not having Ukrainian nation as a nation with its own national self-identification. So basically what Russia wanted from Ukraine was submission and non-existence as an independent sovereign state. And for that, we can have so many different proofs and evidences from our history. If you look back at the history of Ukraine a couple of centuries ago, you will see all those tens of different decrees by Russian tsars, which banned Ukrainian culture, banned Ukrainian language, banned anything that would let Ukrainians actually survive as a separate nation. The same goes for the Soviet Union, all those years under, I would say, even occupation, because for the Baltic states, for Ukraine, all those years under Soviet Union, those were also not something we'd probably like to have, but that's the same there. We can remember deportation of Crimean Tatars in 1944. We can remember Holodomor of 1932, 1933, when Ukrainians and different ethnic groups living in Ukraine and not submitting to Russia, they were actually either starved to death or deported or actually killed. And the same tactics we're seeing now. So talking about the situation in Ukraine at the moment, It's not only about shellings, it's not only about those missile attacks, which of course we see every day, but it's also about forceful deportation of millions of Ukrainian people to Russia. Those are Russian-speaking Ukrainians, those are Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, it doesn't matter. But we have more than 2 million of people now forcefully deported to Russia from the occupied territories, and we have no idea what's going on with them. We have more than 600,000 children being taken away from their families, from their parents, and then brought to Russia, to different parts, from Siberia to whatever regions of Ukraine, and they changed the legislation so that it would be easier to adopt those children. So this is also a demographic policy which is directed at, again, not having Ukraine as a state and Ukrainians as a nation. And the same goes, unfortunately, to all those filtration camps which we now have on the occupied territories. And I think we also have to talk about this, because this is an important part of what Russia is doing now. It's kind of Nazi-style concentration camps, filtration camps, which we have on the occupied territories, where people are very often tortured, where people are very often killed, or they are just intimidated, and they have to go through all those humiliating procedures there. So for this reason, when we're talking about any kind of peace talks or compromises with Russia, we have to keep it in mind that we're talking about, or not talking about, possible compromise between partial genocide against Ukrainians and then Russian aggression in Ukraine. So I think we have to be clear here about all these acts, and this is not just a war to which we have two parts. This is clear act of invasion and aggression of one country on the territory of another one. Talking about the possible escalation and why I think the world has reacted in not maybe very active and a result away from the very beginning, just being afraid to trigger Russia, not to have more escalation from Russia. If we look at what happened later after the start of invasion, I think that, again, it's clear that Russia escalates at weaknesses and it withdraws at force. It's not the other way around. Everyone was afraid about Ukraine getting this candidate status to the European Union because Russia will attack Ukraine again and it will escalate. Nothing happened, because what we saw afterwards, Peskov and all those nice guys from the Russian government came and said, well, okay, we actually were never against Ukrainian EU membership, we were against Ukraine's NATO membership. Then the same story happened with Finland and Sweden. Everyone was afraid of what happens in case Sweden and Finland becomes NATO members and how Russia will react. And of course, Russia had all that nice show with moving some of the missiles to the Kaliningrad Oblast, but nothing happened. Because when Russia cannot do anything, when there is no space for Russia to actually intimidate and blackmail other parties, then Russia withdraws. So this is all very much about blackmailing and about trying to maintain this myth of Russian greatness, of the greatness of Russian army, no chances to defeat Russia on the battlefield, or rather Putin's regime and everything which is connected to it on the battlefield. But all developments in Ukraine showed first that the great so-called, quote unquote, great Russian army is very much corrupt. This myth of greatness, which has been created so far, it's very much hollow. I don't say that Russia does not have technologies, that Russia does not have weapons. Obviously it has, but if we have concerted efforts to counter and to stop aggression, then there is a lot to do together, not to be afraid of Russia, but rather to act in a very joint and consolidating mode. 2 points more, what we will see in the future and what we will not see in the future, and then again to leave some space for discussions. Well, what we will see in the future, of course, is a changing of Russian rhetoric, of Russian actually methods of waging this warfare. Obviously, there is nothing to do for Russia on the battlefield. When Russian army is facing Ukrainian army, we see what happens. And if the Ukrainian army is properly armed, of course, if we're outgunned, outmanned, there is the case for protracted conflict. So if we don't want to have a protracted conflict, what we need to have is, of course, more weapons, more sophisticated systems coming from our allies. But because Russia, again, is experiencing hard times now on the battlefield with Ukrainian soldiers and officers who are very much motivated, it will switch to different tactics, including, of course, blackmailing. And that will be about everything. That will be about food security, which we have seen so far. This will be about energy blackmailing, including but not limited to threat of attacks on the nuclear power plants and to gas prices and to actually gas supplies and oil supplies. And that will be about attacks which we now have on critical civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. So maybe new waves of refugees, because this is how Russia is operating. It's weaponizing everything, even the most humanitarian issues. So again, energy, refugees, food inflation, those are multiple crises, but the root cause is the same cause, and that is Russian aggression. So if we want to deal with the consequences on a case-based principle, that's one way to go. If we want to have world coming back to normal as soon as possible, we will probably have to deal with the root cause of that, which is Russian aggression. And for that, we only have to defeat them on the battlefield. Second point, what we will see from the Russian side will be change in information campaign. The first stage of this war, information war, I would say that was I would not say simple victory for Ukraine, but that was a pretty clear victory for Ukraine, because now it's obvious who is the aggressor side and who is the victim. But the second part would be about trying to undermine the West's resolve to supply more arms to Ukraine, to maintain sanctions pressure, and to actually maintain support for Ukraine. And that will be also, unfortunately, about discrediting the Ukrainian government, the president of Ukraine, and generally Ukraine, labeling us a corrupt country. So all those narratives which you might have heard from Western media and basically all media everywhere, weapons not making the whole way through to the front line, politicians being corrupt, whatever, all supplies and all assistance there being actually inefficient and not helping Ukraine and rather damaging Ukraine because the civilians are being killed and so on and so forth, which is of course not the truth. Because even if we were, and we might be corrupt to some extent, it's again about survival and being corrupt. So even to be corrupt, you first have to survive. So that means you have to defeat Russians and afterwards to talk about what we do and how we operate. And again, it's not about that level of corruption that Russians are talking about. So that will be this huge campaign of not directly, but indirectly trying to undermine trust in Ukrainian government, both in Ukraine and outside of the country, trust in the possibility for Ukraine to win this war, and then again trying to find all those different ways to get back to business as usual and just to make Ukraine looking like a troublemaker just because we don't want to have any kind of peace talks, compromises, and so on. But here again, talking more about the Ukrainian public opinion and Ukrainian expert community, I cannot see any chance for any peace talks before our territory is liberated. That is not only official position, which has been voiced by Ambassador Bodnar, but that is also how public opinion in Ukraine is now. It's not about stopping the war. It's not about stopping the fire or getting the solution as soon as possible, which of course we would like to have, but that is about what solution we have. Because it's crucial for Ukrainians what will happen in the next years. If we stop now, halfway, I'm pretty sure that we will have another attacks by Russian Federation on Ukraine, on other neighboring countries, just after some time to regroup forces, to relocate some forces, and then we will just encourage Russia for further acts of aggression in the neighborhood. We have to stop it now. This has been a very clear victory of Ukraine and the rules-based world order. International criminal is crucial. I haven't seen a lot of that coverage in Turkish media, but the level of rapings and war crimes on the occupied territories, it's huge. And that is part of the psychological warfare again. And that's not only about Ukraine. We have seen the same in Chechnya. We have seen the same in Georgia. We have seen the same in Syria. And now we are seeing, unfortunately, the same in Ukraine. Because we are not a Muslim and conservative society, our women can talk more about what has happened to them. And because I'm also, former female diplomat, I would get a lot of letters and addresses and appeals to do something with that, because it's also something which creates precedents for the future. And if we do not react, we will legitimize these mass atrocities and these rapings and this psychological warfare on Ukrainian females, but also males, in terms of sexual and gender-based atrocities as a new normal for the future. So it's crucial to have this international court, international tribunal, and really to get those who are responsible for those war crimes to accountability. I think I will stop here, just summarizing once again. So from my point of view, and I would say from many of Ukrainian experts, number one, what we need is, of course, more weapons, sophisticated ones, and especially air defense systems to protect our civil and critical infrastructure. What we need is political concerted efforts of our allies, and bringing those responsible to accountability, not to have the continuation of the same in the future. Thank you so much, and I will be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Yevgenia, we appreciate it. And now the floor is open for questions. Is there anybody who would like to pose a question to our panelists?
No questions. What questions? This was everything from both sides, from governmental and non-governmental.
I think Ambassador Ildam would like to ask a question. Please, Ambassador Ildam.
Well, first of all, thank you for this meeting. And I would like to express my thanks and appreciation for our speakers. I listened carefully to all the points that you made. There are a few to highlight. One, it is necessary, of course, to see your Western allies and friends to continue supporting your efforts on the ground. And I think what's happening right now at Kharkiv Oblast will also help those countries, and particularly their publics, to understand that the support given to the Ukrainian forces are making a tangible difference on the ground. So it is an important development, not only to gain ground by Ukrainian forces, but also for the psychology that is needed to be kept in Western capitals. When we look at those demonstrations in Czechia, and we may assume that similar demonstrations may take place in the coming weeks and months with the approaching winter season. And you rightly alluded to how Russians are weaponizing different things, including energy and food security. Therefore, this is one important consideration to have in mind, because to me, sustainability of Western support is crucial. And at that point, the question of the societal resilience, on the one hand, in Russia versus Western capitals, is yet another crucial element to keep in mind. Now, regarding the information space and all the disinformation tactics Russians are using, when I attended a meeting last week in Bucharest, few participants were dwelling upon the narrative Russians were using, that they were not, in fact, fighting against Ukraine, but NATO, since there were special operations forces on the ground. So my question is whether you see a likelihood of mobilization on the part of Russia. So far, they couldn't do it because it was portrayed as a special operations, not war. But since NATO is coming more and more into the information space, their disinformation narrative, could it be possible? Because we are talking about 2 million reserve forces. Even if 10% is mobilized, it is quite a considerable number. And my last point is, I was very heartened when you said that for Ukrainian people, it is an absolute necessity not to engage in any exercise like Minsk process. And it would be essential to make sure that all occupied territories are left by the occupiers, the Russian forces. Because one worry that I have always maintained was, even if out of necessity, dire circumstances, if Ukrainian government sees it fit to engage with Russia for any ceasefire or peace negotiations, how should international community react? Because what is in question is the validity of principles, fundamental principles that should govern rules-based international order, which relate to European security. Therefore, I would like to know how public approaches it, because it is not an easy situation. And I salute the heroic efforts of the Ukrainian people. This is something deserves praise, but I would also like to know how the mood in Ukrainian society is developing in these dire circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Shall we get some other questions, or are you willing to? Okay.
Let's maybe step by step, because we will be then stuck in the monologue of someone of us.
Okay.
So, fully agree with all your suggestions related support from the West, but let's not only look to the directly West, but also to the capabilities of Ukrainian armed forces. It's not the weapons who are fighting, but it's Ukrainian people who are fighting with these weapons. So stronger we will be, quicker the war will be over. The morale, and it's linked to the both armed forces and society, is very pro-victory. Yes, it's related to the narratives which is pushed to the society, to beliefs which society believe, but also to the casualties and sufferings. Because, for example, in the house of my mother live a couple of families which relocated themselves from Kharkiv and Kyiv. And the feeling was from the very beginning how to hide themselves, but now the feeling is how to revenge. Because, for example, family from Kharkiv, they have a destroyed house, they have looted belongings, they have nowhere to turn back. So, and the next step will be reconstruction. That's also the issue which is in the mind, and already the government and society and local authorities start to work what is secure. What is not secure, it's being just in the, let's say, most needed way to do. Sustainability in the West will be the target of the Russian propaganda and Russian activities. And all these endeavors related to both starting negotiations or destroying the unity of West using different countries like Hungary, like some German politicians, etc., it will be continued in particular in this heating season. So, but the basic response should be taken under, responsibility is taken by the governments of these countries, will lead to further supplies to Ukraine, whatever they could supply. And for example, the situation in Czech Republic was clearly shown and expressed by the government of this country as, yes, we understand the people, but it was also Russians who tried to use this and manipulate because of their influences. And also with the possible mobilizations, it's already going on. If you could witness what Russia is doing in the regions, composing these volunteer battalions, they already increased, as you mentioned, about 10%. They already increased their armed forces for 10% because they enlisted more than 170,000 troops additionally to their armed forces, which is enlisted. So it's ordinary armed forces. It is and it's still huge in the numbers. It's more than 2 million. But the fighting capabilities, the morale, the supply lines, and many other crucial elements which are necessary for continuing the war or organize the full-fledged mobilization and mobilize the whole. What it will achieve? Yes, they could, let's say, send these people to the front line like Shalmit, or how it's called correctly. I mean, the guys who will die on the first battle or the first combat activities. They will need to pay money for them because first amount of money they are paying for those who are in service. Second amount of money they should pay for those who are dead or injured. And you might see in this letter from Ministry of Defense to Ministry of Finance in Russia, asking for this amount of money there. So the estimation's already done. So they planned how many people will be killed from their side as well. It means that they have no plan to stop the war. They will increase the number. They will, I don't know, bring any new weapons or old weapons which they have. They will take it from both Iran, North Korea, China, whatever they could do. But up until liberation of the territories or some other, I don't know, I couldn't prejudge or speculate what could happen that we should stop or start to, let's say, to think in otherwise. So our logic is very simple. We have no way out. Otherwise, as Evgeny correctly said, they will restore their capabilities and continue attacks. We wouldn't like to have a war forever. We need to stop it and finally adopt some decision which will lead to the preserving of territorial integrity of Ukraine and punish Russia for their crimes. We don't care about their future. We will be armed now forever because we feel it as the existential threat for us. And no one will, let's say, impose other thoughts to the society which suffers so much. It's my belief. It's maybe as well.
Well, if I may, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah. Please
yeah,
do so.
If I may just add in a couple of things about the general public opinion and how we feel in society, fighting, not fighting. I think there is sometimes this misunderstanding, and thank you, Ambassador, for pointing it out, because that's what many people would ask me. We are not choosing between fighting against Russians in Ukraine and having a peaceful life. On the occupied territories of Russia, we have seen, and unfortunately we will see in the future, the same situation which we had in Bucha, in Gostomel, in many other places, with thousands of people being killed and tortured to death. So the only dilemma which Ukrainian society and Ukrainian civilians are facing now is to be killed by Russian missiles and Russian shellings, or to be killed under occupation by torturers and by all kinds of mass atrocities. Kharkiv region has just been liberated. We already know about more than 1,000 people, civilians, being tortured and killed. The same situation, unfortunately, will be in Kherson region. The same situation we have now in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. I just talked to some officials from Energoatom, and they say that those people who are kind of trying to maintain the work of that NPP and cooperate with Ukraine, they're also kidnapped and killed. So for us, the choice is very clear. If we want to survive, we have to fight. And that is the general feeling in Ukrainian society. If we have support from the West or if we don't, if we get arms or if we don't, I have all those Telegram channels and chats with news going on in Odessa, which is my region, and which is kind of popular for having this sense of humor. And every time you have alert of air raid coming, people are asking literally, do you know any handmade things how to hit missile if it's flying very low over your balcony? So that is the general resilience and resistance of Ukrainian people to fight, even if we don't have arms, to fight with what we have, with jars of pickled cucumbers hitting Russian UAVs and so on. So there is no will to compromise on territories. And the second point, also very shortly about the mobilization in Russia and NATO fighting against Russia. Of course, Russians have to somehow justify and explain to their own Russian citizens what is going now, why their so-called 3 days operation is now lasting for 6 months, and why they have to withdraw. So hence we see all these so-called gestures of goodwill when they withdraw forces, when they're not able to keep the control in the area anymore. But that is also very telling, because they cannot mobilize openly people, hidden, yes, but not openly, because it's very different if you want to mobilize someone from Moscow, if you want to mobilize someone from St. Petersburg area, from what happens when you're mobilizing representatives of different ethnic minorities from Tuva region, Buryatia, and all those distant places in the far east or far north. Because those people, they don't know their rights very often. They are trying to gain some money, and they do not have these, let's say, mechanisms of self-organization to question the legitimacy of all those actions in Putin's regime as such. Now what we're seeing is that Putin himself is afraid of a general mobilization. It's not about NATO, it's about those people who would probably turn to Kremlin to ask what is going on and why we're paying those millions of rubles and why we have this awful inflation inside Russia. It's not only about inflation in other countries, it's also about the dire economic situation in Russia. So I think that we should not overestimate, not downplay, of course, but not overestimate the possibilities and capacities of Putin's regime to have even more people mobilized, because they have pretty much used everything that they have had, all kind of tools, mechanisms, and types of private military companies, Rosgvardia, armed forces, whatever. So I don't think that we can see any escalation there. But of course, it's too early to celebrate victory and say that Ukraine has won this war. No, but again, there is no other option for us.
Thank you, Yevgenia. Now we have some questions posed via the chat room. There are 2 questions and 1 request for the floor. Let me raise these questions to both of you. The first question comes from Ali Clinch, and his question is as follows. How do you think the assassination of the daughter of Alexander Dugin will affect the ongoing conflict? Does it matter in the issue? That's his question. Second question comes from Alperen Turan, and let me rephrase a bit. He is asking, what kind of support the Ukrainian government gets or intends to get from the EU, NATO, and the UN, especially in which domains can these international organizations be of use for Ukrainians? Now, following your answers, we will give the floor to Ambassador Ayşe Sezgin. Thank you.
Dugina have been already forgotten. I don't know for what reason she died. Most probably, previously I served in Russia for 4 years. I know their behavior. So they are killing people to reattract attention. Dugina was not engaged in the war. I have never seen her in any public comments. And if Ukrainians would plan to assassinate someone, it will not be for sure Dugin or his daughter. No reasons for us. it's better to do with Putin or with somebody else. So maybe there were some reasons, but let's not speculate. So the other question is related to the support of international organizations. First of all, you already answered with the strong support with the financial assistance and granting a candidature status. It's the geopolitical answer to the war, and it's the civilization dimension story which will lead to the fast integration of Ukraine to the EU. It actually also gives a lot of responsibility to Ukraine, how fast we could be, but EU responded correctly. With NATO in UN, actually they failed, unfortunately. NATO as an organization practically did nothing. Rammstein, which includes NATO countries and some other countries outside the NATO, they are doing their best to support Ukraine. So this is the new format of support. But as an organization, NATO actually, unfortunately, failed to do what possibly could be done here. First of all, with the perspective of membership. It's the political dimension of the story, but it could facilitate strongly and also give a hope for Ukraine for protection in future. And also could get some more support from Ukraine in practical terms, because now we are the most skilled armed forces fighting with Russia. And Russia is considered to be the enemy of NATO. So we are the most valuable partner for NATO in practical terms. UN tried to help, actually, but they didn't even did 1% of their responsibility. So and UN show how weak this organization and the structure as a whole. UN Security Council, UN, the other international organizations within the structure of UN, they were very weak presenting according to their duties. I'm not saying about what they can do. They should do. A lot of things starting from our civilians and our prisoners failed completely. With the grain agreement, if Turkey will not be involved, they will fail because they couldn't convince neither Russians nor us with the green terms. With the Red Cross and other international organizations which should help in organizing green corridors or something also failed. Only direct communication between Russian and Ukrainian authorities allowed to create such a corridors, and to some extent it works. So many criticism to UN, but I will not run so far. So in this regard, EU jumped over itself. It became much more stronger. It's become much more decisive, and it started to think about reconstruction, not in the terms of being a bureaucratic mechanism, which we traditionally criticize or have been criticizing, but start to think as a political leader. But NATO, unfortunately, did not respond correctly to the existing situation, because I believe that the adequate response should be at least with stronger sanctions and different agreed policy towards Russia, not just a political statements. In this situation, when the people are dying, it's not an adequate response. It's my point of view, both personal and maybe official. I could also talk about that maybe in discussion.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yevgeny, would you like to make some remarks?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I pretty much agree with what Ambassador has said. I would just say that with the Dugin question, that's a very clear, blunt info operation. There are two countries where a lot of attention has been given to this case. One is Russia and the second one is Turkey. I haven't seen it anywhere, including in Ukraine, being covered a lot. In other countries and in Turkey, I would say mostly thanks to Perinçek family, Aydınlık and other guys there. So this is definitely not an issue to consider seriously. It's all about reflective control. It's all about information operations. And I think that's clear, nothing to talk about there. On the second question, because Ambassador covered a lot what is about Ukraine, I would say that for the international order and generally for us, what happened with the reaction of the EU, United Nations and NATO is very telling in two terms. We need reforms. One is veto power in United Nations Security Council. And the second one is the unanimity principle of voting in NATO and European Union. So what has been made clear by reaction to the situation in Ukraine and to the Russian aggression, until we have such countries like Russia and maybe China on some other questions in the United Nations Security Council being able to block any decision, it will be completely ineffective, inefficient, and pretty much clumsy bureaucratic organization with no real leverages to change situation on the ground. Remember what happened on the Azov style defenders with the Red Cross and all other parties involved, what happened with the, and is still happening, Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and International Atomic Energy Agency, other United Nations agencies. It's very much about procedures and norms which block rather than encourage further action. So we need reform there. Second is again about the same right to block or to not to let the decision-making processes go further, as we've seen with some countries inside NATO, when it's much easier to get support on the bilateral level with separate NATO nations or to create a coalition of the will, Rammstein style or any others, than to actually have decisions inside these organizations. So if we want to move forward, if we want to adapt, and if we want to show that these organizations are still relevant, we have to change them. We have to have those reforms. Otherwise, we're actually helping Russians to show that the rules-based world order is no more functional, that liberal democratic institutions are not efficient, and the only way to move forward is to use the power actually and the aggression which Russia is using. So I'd say it's, yes, it's about certain reactions, but it's also about structural problems that those organizations are facing now.
Thank you, Yevgeny Hanım. We have two questions in a row. The first one will be posed by Ambassador Sezgin and the second by Aslı Aydın Taşbaş. I think you have raised your hand, right, Aslı Hanım? Okay. But before giving the floor, let me try to clarify a point with regard to NATO. Now, NATO itself does not have assets and capabilities apart from like AWACS aircraft stationed in Geilenkirchen, Germany, and air-to-ground surveillance system situated in Italy, Sigonella. It depends on military assets and capabilities allocated by its member states. What had been done, and there had been a series of criticisms within NATO when Russia occupied and annexed Crimea, that there was not a strong reaction as in 2022. I mean, that was discussed in NATO. But the point here is what NATO can do, of course, and it introduced a comprehensive support package, training, standardization, interoperability, and what have you. This is where NATO plays a role, a critical role. And I think it did help the Ukrainian army. Other than that, there was this defense capacity building initiative launched after the Wales summit in 2014. The enhancement of the status of Ukraine within NATO, so that's what NATO can do. It depends on, assets and capabilities dedicated to NATO or allocated to NATO by its allies. But on a bilateral, trilateral, or quadrilateral basis, of course, the NATO members are free to support Ukraine from a military, political, financial, and other, aspects. I have to make this remark to cast light on what NATO did. I mean, if you ask me whether it did enough after 2014, or rather before 2014, that's a legitimate question, of course, particularly in the wake of Russia-Georgia war in 2008. And that had always been a hot debate within NATO, even before 2014, which intensified after 2014. So maybe I've said rather long remarks, but I felt the need to to bring clarification to this issue. Now, the
Ambassador,
floor is...
may I just add a small, I know, Your Excellency, that you will react in such a manner because you know much more better than me about NATO.
Mm-hmm.
you served for a long period of time together with Ambassador. So you know it from inside.
Yeah,
you know what NATO can. And before the war, NATO did a lot for strengthening Ukrainian capabilities. I have nothing against that. And I'm fully, let's say, taking my head off of my... let's say, head about that support of NATO. But from the beginning of war, NATO have a possibility to lead the countries in contradicting exact aggression, which could tomorrow hit NATO. Mm-hmm. So let's say, the policy which was provided even in this meeting in Madrid was completely irrelevant to the war activities which took place in Ukraine. So when I ask our colleagues from the ministry, let's think about some more stronger wording. I'm not saying about the tanks and the aircraft. Let's speak about stronger wording in the statement. I received a response, it's tricky moment. Now it's the only time, most probably, that NATO could adopt a strong and relevant decision with regard to the situation in Europe. Otherwise, tomorrow, NATO should send forces to Lithuania or Poland to defend their soil. And if it is understandable for the, let's say, security perspective, that's a different story. I'm only saying about that adequate reaction to the war should be the readiness for the war, but not the weak declarations with regard to Ukrainian military perspective. It's only about that. Sorry for.
Okay, no problem. Thank you very much indeed.
If I may just very shortly and briefly,
please.
Why it's not only about Ukraine, it's also about other countries. I was in Turkey in 2015 when the Russian jet was hit. And since 2015, I've got hundreds of questions from all kinds of experts and everyone in Turkey. Why should we care about NATO if the Article 5 doesn't work even for Turkey? So that is how we provide Russia with an argument to say, look, there is nothing about NATO there. They don't care about their member countries. They don't care about defending any other countries rather than, let's say, France and Germany and the US. It's all about, just nice meetings and diplomacy there. So very often, again, it's not about, I know the procedures, how NATO works. It's not about providing certain weapons or arms. It's about the rhetoric, because the statements like NATO is not going to be involved in this war anyhow, they do not really help, because they give a carte blanche to Russia to do what it does. It's not necessarily escalating the war, but at least leaving some, ambiguity there on how NATO will proceed is really important. So sometimes it's how we create, it's also about public diplomacy for NATO itself, basically.
Thank you. I think a very, very brief intervention by Ambassador İldem before we give the floor to Ambassador Sezgin and Aslı Hanım. Ambassador İldem, please.
Well, I certainly sympathize what you say regarding your expectations from the Madrid summit meeting. But if you ask my personal opinion, it was a very solid declaration of support from NATO to Ukraine. Not only with words, but also with certain activities, decisions. Let us not forget that reinforcement of the eastern flank is also an important consideration for Russia. And my very brief second point is that I don't think that we were talking about invocation of Article 5 in the context of the shooting down of a Russian plane. What we meant was the emergency session to be convened, North Atlantic Council to be convened upon the request of Turkey to discuss the issue and to express its solidarity with Turkey in this difficult situation. But Turkey or anybody else did not ask invocation of Article 5 at that time. So I rather find it artificial and somewhat nonsensical for those who were telling you that NATO was not siding with Turkey, showing solidarity, but by not invoking Article 5. I don't think that this is the right context to talk about Article 5.
Exactly. There were 2 extraordinary sessions and Turkey invoked Article 4 consultations twice, a total of 4 consultations within NATO. But anyway, I mean, let's get back to Ayşe Hanım. Ayşe, Ambassador Sezgin, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank Ambassador Bodnar and Ms. Gaber and thank them for being with us tonight, and also reiterate again that our hearts and minds are with Ukraine. Instead of NATO, I will dwell upon a little bit on Ukraine's EU membership. First of all, I would like to congratulate Ukraine for obtaining the candidate status to become member to the EU. I personally think, I wish it was done earlier. I know and I have witnessed since long time that Ukraine was aspiring to become a member and striving to convince EU members for granting candidate status. And instead of waiting the outbreak of such a horrendous war, I think this strategic decision could have been taken earlier, instead of insisting that Ukraine be in Eastern Partnership. I remember, if my memory is betraying me, please correct me, but I remember in 2017, even Holland was so timid in convincing its parliament to pass the enhanced partnership agreement between EU and Ukraine. So I think now that this stage has been successful, I'm happy to see Ukraine among the let's say EU family. But we all know the process is long, and there are 2 reasons. There are many more, but there are 2 reasons. First of all, the ongoing war, and at the same time, the EU is in the process of its own deliberations on its future. But in the meantime, so as to create a European political space, this idea of European political union was launched by Mr. Macron. And on the 6th of October, I think, in Prague, the first meeting will be held. It's not a structured organization as far as I understand, but it's going to be a leaders summit, and it will continue like that for some time. The idea is not new. It was launched by Mr. Mitterrand in the early 90s, but he had the idea of a confederation where Russia would also be included. But at that time, the Eastern and Central European states, first of all, they thought that it would be a replacement for their membership. And secondly, they did not want to take place in a structure where Russia was there. Now that Ukraine has obtained this candidate status, we all know, due to the Agenda 2000, one of the I would say criteria for membership is resolving all border disputes. And I know that EU has presented 7 criteria for Ukraine, 9 for Moldova, and I think 12 for Georgia to be declared as candidate. How do you see this mechanism, which is just being launched? And I personally don't see it as a replacement for EU membership, but how do you think it will relate to the EU membership? And are you satisfied with the idea? Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, thank you for the question. Really, it's more for discovery. What does Macron and others mean in this initiative, than the real answer to the, let's say, existing situation. So first of all, you correctly mentioned about previous Mitterrand initiative. Then it was initiative of one of the previous president of France about this Black Sea cooperation, something which could substitute the membership for Turkey. And now there is some other initiatives, and it also, before the decision about the European candidacy was adopted, Macron came to Ukraine and tried to convince us to agree on something else than candidature status. So it's all might be considered as only as a supplementary issues to the, or supplementary tracks to the correct way of European integration. It means you obtain association membership or association status, then candidature status and membership. Nothing else in a visible perspective is not, Ukraine is not interested in. So we could participate in all possible initiatives. We have this Eastern Partnership for a long period of time, neighborhood policy, everything which could in practical terms facilitate the process. Two hands full. But if someone, if you say a single word that it should substitute the right for membership, it will be demolished fully. So, and there were a number of such initiatives. If used them wisely, and let's say not to go in contradictions with these ideas, because then you will face some obstacles in the process of integration. Then it could be, let's say, well integrated to the existing process of integration. And as well with the criteria. So the criteria are every time changing. So one criteria has been for Poland to join EU, the second is just set to Turkey, and the third will be to Ukraine and Moldova. Maybe for Georgia also something else. But already our officials and government already announced that we will do everything possible to comply with everything. We're not judging, we just receive these questions and we start to work on them. So it also linked very closely to the association agreement implementation, which was actually in process. And let's be honest, we didn't fulfill it 100%. So, and the candidature status also not overlap, but supplement this demands from the association agreements. So we will continue to do this, and the structure is already created. Ministries have their, let's say, responsibilities, and the both vertical and horizontal structures have been created for implementation of this. How fast and effective it will be, it's still the question, because first, the financial side, mostly needed for the reforms. Secondly, war, how it will continue, how will it affect. I will not put in the question, under the question, the political will, because it's visible how strong it is for the membership perspective, but we understand that we couldn't escape some grades in growing up in our school, I would say in brackets school, that we should first go to the first grade, then to the second, and pass all the terms. Maybe it could be shortened than the standard periods of integration, but it will take some time, and it will not be overnight for sure. But it also depends on us as well.
Thank you. Aslanım, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Ceylan. Ambassador Bodnar and also Yevgenia, I think Yevgenia is also here, yes. Well, first of all, congratulations on the counteroffensive by Ukrainian forces. I think it's very significant what's happening in Kharkiv Oblast. I don't know enough about military, I don't have enough military expertise to know whether or not that's a watershed moment, but psychologically it does seem to be one. But I was struck by your comments. Both of you have very deliberately underlined the fact that Ukraine is no longer interested in a negotiated settlement unless Russia leaves the territories, Ukrainian territories it has occupied. To me, this is slightly different from the Ukrainian position back in April when Russian and Ukrainian delegations met in Istanbul. Based on my conversations with Turkish officials, but also Ukrainian officials, and also based on President Zelensky's comments, it seemed like he was more, Ukraine was more interested in a negotiated settlement provided there are security guarantees. Can you please explain this difference? I mean, you're clearly laying out a firmer stance on the idea of negotiations and a negotiated settlement. Secondly, I hope this is a watershed moment for the occupation, but there's also the risk that Russians may escalate in ways that we can imagine or not imagine. I was struck by Putin's comments a few days ago that the grain deal, for example, is not working. Can you give me your sense of what he's trying to do when he is criticizing the grain deal, saying it's not working for poor countries? Is that a way of reopening negotiations on the grain deal, since it was only for a short duration? Maybe speculate for me how Russia might respond to its military losses in Kharkiv and over the past 2 weeks.
It starts from the end. They already responded.
For both of you.
Yes, London. So Russians already responded with the attacks on civilian infrastructure. What they can do harder or easier. So for us, we have already passed this corridor of pain. So the level of destruction and the number of casualties have not been touchable to the Ukrainian society anymore. Before that, we have been crying on every casualty. Now, unfortunately, people are used to it. And our price for freedom is very high, but we are paying it. And that is not decision of the government. That's people would say, and they go freely to the front line and then fight for the victory. And that is not about the negotiations. So negotiations lead to some kind of compromise, which means Ukrainian neutrality in exchange of guarantees. But guarantee doesn't mean that they will continue attacks on other territories. They try to sell their withdrawal of forces from north of Ukraine as the goodwill related to the negotiation. Had nothing to do with that. It's total lie. They have no lines of supply. They do not have enough of forces. They just reconcentrated their military equipment and destroyed armored units to the east and start new offensive. Second, the brutalities, the number of casualties which we already suffered, and I mean all these cruelties, rapes, etc. It's also broke the pain line or the pain corridor or whatever we could call them. So it's a different perspective from Ukraine. So we understand that any negotiations with the Russians will lead only to the subjugation of us, nothing else, because they will convince Germany, France, United States, United Kingdom, whatever it possibly be, that they are good-willing and only Ukraine is bad-willing and they should stay on the territories they occupy. No, they have no right. They broke all the bilateral agreements, they broke all the international law, and either they are withdrawing forces or they will be pulled back. It doesn't matter. Will we be supplied by the West? Will we be supplied with the West? Will we take the weapons from them? Whatever it's possible, because still today for us, the border with Belarus and Russia, it's also the front line. Every day, shellings from the Russian side of the border from Russian territories are continuing in Chernihiv Oblast, in Sumy Oblast, in Kharkiv Oblast, and even if we pull them back from Kharkiv Oblast, it doesn't mean that the Kharkiv is safe, because Belgorod is very close, and the range of missiles or artillery systems could reach the outskirts of Kharkiv. It's still in danger. So what we can do? We could pray for the pardon or give up? No, there is no way for that. So we already passed it in April, when there was a floor for some kind of arrangements, and there was also understanding about withdrawal of forces. It was not about the occupation. We have never agreed any concessions of the territory to Russian side. And even if we have been talking about Crimea as postponed status for 15 years, it was our proposal. Or where we talked that, okay, Donbass region, which was up until the 24th of February, could be a matter of discussions for future. These positions were valid for the April, but then they broke all the previously agreed terms or principles. I wouldn't say terms, but principles. If you will see, maybe time will come, you will see the document which they proposed to us at the beginning of war, then you will understand what they would like for us. I have read this document. Unfortunately, I didn't have it in my hand, but it is something which change your mind completely about Russia. I will not speculate anymore, but it's a long story of pain, angriness, and I'm still curious how our people, I mean, from the negotiation team could keep themselves from, let's say, from some inadequate actions during the negotiation table. Sorry for being emotional.
And the grain deal, maybe? Why is Putin?
The grain deal is very simple. So as you remember, they signed an agreement. So we have this two-part agreement, which we signed with Turkey and UN, and they say the same. But they also have a memorandum of understanding between Russia and UN. It was the second document, which was not signed with the same premises, but which was signed online. And according to this document, UN should help them somehow to work with their agriculture products and some kind of mineral resources to sell it abroad. But most probably they couldn't find a way to implement it. As I already said, that UN maybe took too much of its responsibility that they couldn't implement. And that's the problem of relations between UN and Russia. But indeed, the problem is inside the behavior and the policy of Russia, which instead of, let's say, de-escalating situation for their own benefits, they are trying to escalate. And the first escalation was just after the signing of the agreement. So it was like, as we said, that they just, let's say, make a clap on the face of signatories because they already attacked. So they already broke the agreement. Formally, yes, but we are continuing to implement it because we need it, Volta need it, and we need to be more, let's say, more reliable partner than the Russians, and we are not copying them. So most probably they will put the question under discussion during the meeting in Almaty, or where it will be, in this short meeting. Yes, together with President Erdogan, and they will try to discuss it. But if you will see the real picture, we already published it, and our Minister of Infrastructure, Mr. Kubrakov, already published it in the Twitter, showing where the grain goes directly, what the country is, the dimension, amount, how many ships have been ordered. So actually, it is not our responsibility to sell where the grain. So if UN would like to supply to poor countries, they could do it. But let's be honest. So that one fourth of this grain goes to Turkey, and in Turkey, yeah, they are reworked and goes to the same market, but as a pasta, as a flavor, as everything, because it's a simple. So, for example, Sudan does not have a lot of enterprises that could replenish the grain. They are just receiving a flavor and pasta and some other ready-to-eat products. It's also a reality. And also maybe they're not too rich to buy it, but so we have nothing to do with it. It's just the, let's say, business has to whom to sell. Because the agreements on this grain have been signed maybe before the war, half of the year, because it's like futures agreements. And that's why, but they're trying to manipulate and try to change the reality for their own benefits. So most probably they will try to not to prolong it. I don't think they will try to cut it down, because in November it will be over. Officially 120 days, but we will see.
Thank you. Yevgenia, would you like to add something?
Yes, thank you, Asli, for your question. While talking about the peace talks in April, it's easy for me to respond because the expert community has been very critical of those talks and negotiations from the very beginning. Public opinion in Ukraine, experts from the very beginning were saying that there is no way we can have peace talks with Russia and there is no way we can trust Russians. I think the main idea behind the actions of the Ukrainian government was still to think of the global implications of this war and also to try to help from the very beginning to those countries of the global south who were suffering from the food crisis and to other countries not to suffer the implications of this war. So there was still what the slight hope something can change. And let's be honest, the situation on the ground was very different. So the dynamics of the conflict has changed a lot. But talking about the general mood in public and the expert, that was very critical from the very beginning. So there is this relief now that there are no even talks about peace negotiations or something. It doesn't mean that we will not have them in the future. Obviously, we have to coexist with Russia, but those will be very different negotiations on how to proceed after we are getting back to the borders of 1991, which is the only internationally recognized borders. Second, about how Russia can be escalating in the future and what will happen to the grain deal and so on. Again, you can check online a couple of articles penned by myself, very humble contribution to the whole debate on that. But I was saying from the very beginning, this is temporarily because Russia wants to change narrative. It actually had completely lost the information war and the narratives war before that grain deal, because it was obvious who is the actual aggressor and who is the troublemaker. It's not Ukraine, it's Russia. So it was a needed step to show that Russia can be constructive, Russia can be negotiating, and Russia is kind of willing to bring back grain to the world markets. And second, because even back then it was clear for Russia that they will not be able to proceed for a long period of time. So peace talks might be needed in the future. And just in case to leave the channel for the peace talks, that was presented as a possible first step for comprehensive peace agreement, which is not the case for us. Because for us, I think it's very clear from Ukrainian side, it's very technical. The grain deal is about grain and it's about other countries in the region in the Middle East and Africa. It's not about having peace talks with Russia. But for them, that was also important as part of this general PR campaign that, well, Russia can actually be sitting at the negotiations table and having some negotiations. Apart from what Ambassador mentioned, getting their own Russian grains back to the world market. So for me, that was always a question of when, rather than if Russia will violate this grain deal as it actually did with all the other deals. I think that, again, we have to be very clear what to do next. If we want to have another grain deal, which will be violated by Russia, that's also an option. If not, then we have to think how to unblock the Black Sea generally and how to deoccupy Ukrainian seaports generally. Because the grain is going to the Middle East, Ukrainian grain is going to African countries and to the Western European countries, but it's all about the rules of the market, of the free market. So we have seen already decrease in prices and the change of general atmosphere on the markets, and that is completely contract-based. So there is no way Ukraine can violate those contracts. Last point on the possible violations and the escalations from the Russian side, I think that the main speculation here is the possibilities for the nuclear war. I do not see that happening because this is not what Russia wants, and this is not what Putin can do, because there are so many different people in a row there who will have to take this decision to attack, and because I just don't see any credible answer to the question, what next? So let's imagine there is nuclear attack. So what next, apart from making Ukrainians suffer and making Europeans suffer? I think that Russia will rather go on with nuclear blackmailing, having this nuclear card as another card for blackmailing, and Russia will try to exploit vulnerabilities with all different partners on bilateral level, depending on where each particular country has dependencies on Russia, be it energy supplies, be it nuclear, be it grain, be it information, be it any other dependency. Russia will try to hit hard on those particular vulnerabilities to actually undermine this concerted support for Ukraine by the West, and of course trying to make Ukrainians suffer this war. And the whole grain war, it's not only about supplies to the market, right? It's about how Russians are setting on fire Ukrainian fields, how Russians are shelling Ukrainian depots and silos and storage places, and so on and so forth. So those will be attacks on civilian infrastructure, making people suffer, which will not change the situation for Ukraine.
Thank you. We have come to the end of our webinar. I shall try to be as brief as I can to wrap up what has been said, highlights from today's deliberations, some lessons which were also consulted upon on NATO on different occasions, that you have to negotiate with Russia from a position of strength. That is very important. And the idea to survive. In order to survive, you have to fight and liberate the full occupied territories by Russia. But for Ukraine to achieve it, two W's are very important: the sustainment of the will of the armed forces of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, and the provision of weapons, the continuation of weapons support to Ukraine, not only weapons, but the continuation of political, financial, and legal support to Ukraine. That's very important. And sanctions need to remain in place during the ongoing conflict, that there is continuity in the Russian behavior rooted in history. I remember from my reading of history books that I think like 1860 or 1870, the Tsar in power then said that there is no Ukraine, there's no Ukrainian nation. We are talking about the 19th century, and the same mentality was underlined by Putin in July 2021 in his rather absurd long article that there's no Ukrainian nation, Ukrainian identity, and what have you. But this is rooted in history. So it's, I mean, it cannot be simply and solely attributed to Putin, and that should be taken into account. Now we will continue to see the blackmailing by Russia in different fields, including the information space, the food security and energy security, which will have to be monitored closely by all of us. And we should not underestimate the grave situation created by mass atrocities in the form of rapings, maiming, torturing, abduction of children, and what have you. And maybe there should be a better and more effective campaign on this particular issue, with an eye on achieving accountability of those people involved in those mass atrocities. Another, maybe a military consideration, because both Ambassador and Yevgenia pointed to that there is this Russian doctrine of escalate to dominate, escalate to deter, which is part and parcel of the Gerasimov doctrine. This has proven not effective in Ukraine, and it has demonstrated its weakness. It was effective in Syria, but not effective in Ukraine, as recent events suggest. So these are things that I have taken note down. Of course, I might have left certain. One important point, as from Ambassador's remarks, we have been aware of the fact that it's the strategic goal of Ukraine to be a member of NATO, and after the war, when it's terminated, there will have to be a restructured Euro-Atlantic security concept. That is already evolving, maybe. So let's see how the new strategic concept will be implemented by NATO. So that's all I have. I'm sorry if I've left certain points out. I apologize for that. But I thank once again Ambassador Vasil Bodnar and Yevgenia Gaber for this very productive and thought-provoking webinar for all of us. We wish you success out in the field. All of us are heartened by the successes of Ukraine in the Kharkiv Oblast. Let's hope that this success will continue in other regions under occupation. The Turkey, or Turkey, I'm still not used to it, but anyway, Turkey and her people, by majority, are on the side of Ukraine. despite the fact that there is also, as far as I can see, it's my humble observation that there's a very effective Russian disinformation campaign being launched in Turkey, which is very vocal. But that doesn't mean that the Turkish people are not on the side of Ukraine, which is fighting a war of liberation in your own terms. That's something that our Ukrainian friends should keep in their minds. So with these remarks, I think our webinar should be adjourned. Thank you once again and good evening to everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ambassador, for the invitation and your support to Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.